This is it's December 1st, 2022. This is office hours. We're discussing CI minutes limits, or this configuring CI minute limits per project and subgroup to Epic. We've had a couple of community contributions that have come in, and we'll just get aligned on direction of where we're going with this larger feature set and make sure that those MRs can contribute towards that vision without working around license limits, which is one of the things that we want to make sure that we enforce, especially for our GitLab.com users. So I have the doc shared with everybody. I'll go ahead and share my screen so folks watching the recording can follow along as well. If I could ask somebody to take notes while I'm doing that. So I want to start with the Epic itself and just talk through the problem to solve, making sure that that's clear for everyone. The proposal that's there. And then last night I added this iteration plan, which I tried to call out very much as in draft, making sure that we have the right order of things to implement so that we can link back and get the MRs that are associated with those issues moved along. So I'll start with, are there questions about the problem that we're actually trying to solve here? Can we clarify that language, especially for our wider community contributors on the call? While folks are reading, I'll add a little bit of context. For a self-managed user, the instance admin today can set a quota, I believe, for groups, not for projects, so that a group can have a quota limit. The self-managed users are always using their own runners, though. They're not using the GitLab.com shared SaaS runners. That's where that CI minute limit comes into effect. And so as we work through these, we want to ensure that we're respecting license limits or additional purchased minutes, and that even if we set a quota for over what that limit is, that lower limit is what is actually respected for that group or namespace.
I can give maybe some additional context on the requester side, which is the Drupal project.
Yeah, that'd be great, Nick.
So I shared a link in the Zoom chat for the self-managed GitLab instance that the Drupal project has. They used to self-manage their Git code, whatever, not on GitLab. To sustain the URLs, they actually had to create one group and all the projects under that group. So adding group limits by the admin wouldn't work for them, because there's only one group. And as you can see, there's like almost 2,000 pages of probably 20 projects each or something. So that's why they were looking into getting limitations on a project level. So hopefully that helps in terms of context.
Yeah, this is the community contribution side of this started with the folks in the Drupal project and wanting to set that limit because they have some, I think the use case was there's some projects that are just tests that they only want to run once or twice a month and not have them continually running thousands of minutes all the time, like for every push. And like it only really should be run once or twice a month, I think.
Correct. And also a little bit to prevent abuse on projects that might not have been verified to be critical.
Yeah. Okay. So then moving on to the proposal, what we've proposed, and this is a pretty wide-ranging epic. I think this will end up breaking into some smaller epics as we talk about self-managed versus GitLab.com, projects versus groups. We want to add that level of control at the subgroup and project level. We might need to break those out. Fabio, I know you and I have talked a little bit about, can we actually do this for not just a group, but a subgroup, and allow that control of the quota to reallocate, not really reallocate CI minutes so other projects can get more than others. So the example here, if you have 3 projects under your namespace and you have an ultimate license, really their quota each is 50,000, but that's also a cumulative quota. So what we'd like to do is limit that. So say project A is that test project, and it only gets updated once a month. It should really only get a small amount of minutes. And once it hits that, even if our namespace limit isn't hit, it's done running pipelines for the month or until the next reset. the other projects then could use more. And then I should add actually, I'm going to edit this as we go. I'm going to add a use case here. If project B, once the total limits are reached. Everybody on YouTube gets to watch my horrible typing. No projects can run pipelines. So like we said, more quota, more minutes are just. So for example, project A uses 1,000. B uses 30,000. Project C only 10. No projects. Additional. Just to have that clarification of that top level namespace limit applies. All right. I'm going to skip ahead to the constraints and just talk about those before we talk about iteration plan and the draft. So specific limits for a project or subgroup must not be higher than the monthly limit defined by the root namespace. Ideally, we can set that or we can enforce that. I think that starts to get tricky on GitLab.com or for SaaS because of the additional runner minutes that can be purchased. So while we may allow users to initially set a higher limit, especially as that limit could be variable based on how many minutes roll over month to month, the enforcement would still be at however many minutes you have left. I see nodding from Fabio, so I assume that I'm not lying.
That's correct, because between SaaS and self-managed, there is no difference in where these limits are set. They're always set on the namespace level. Even if we say it's ultimate customer, it sounds like it's applied per plan, like in terms of implementation, but it's actually, we take the plan limit and we set that limit for the specific namespace. So each namespace has its own, we speak about top level namespace. Its top level namespace has its own limit that is set by an administrator. In this case, either SaaS will be directly as you purchase a plan or you register for as a free user, or on self-managed, it will be set by an administrator, either as default instance, as default setting for the instance, or as a specific limit for the namespace. And we can dive into the table that you have with additional details versus like what we are touching here as well.
Yeah. Well, let's do that. So this, I copy pasted a comment and then turned it into a table to try to kind of sketch out a bit of not necessarily the data structure, but how we think about the hierarchy of where those limits apply. So at the very top level, there's the instance limit. This is the license for the SaaS runners. What I don't know is for self-managed, is there an initial limit that gets set, or are all projects and groups set with a quota of unlimited?
So the instance level, it's more like an application limit that application level limit that you define for as a default limit for all namespaces.
Okay.
Which means any new namespace you create will automatically have that limit, unless it's overridden at the namespace level. This is how it works on SaaS. How we give 400 minutes to free users. It's actually not an explicit limit for that top level namespace. For the names, if we look at the namespace, the limit is actually nil. But actually, since it's not set there, it will default to the application level limit, which is set as 400. So by default, every namespace gets 400 minutes.
Okay.
But then as you purchase a license or on self-managed, an administrator sets a limit for that level, top level namespace, then you can have another actual quota is been set specifically for that top level namespace rather than defaulting to the 400 or whatever it's been set at the instance level.
Okay.
Which is basically the first two lines in the table. So the instance level will be on GitLab SaaS would be the 400 minutes set for all free users. And then the namespace level is actually something we override the namespace level, and that takes precedence. And it will be the quota we set for paid users.
Add. Oh man, HTML tables, it's been too long. This instance limit.
Yeah. So on self-managed, if I want any new groups to automatically take 10,000 minutes, for example, I can set the default limit as an admin. But if I want a very specific group to take maybe more minutes or less minutes, and I can set a specific limit for that top level namespace. And this is functionality we have today.
So this is functionality we have today. This is functionality we have today. I will fix my table later. Okay, so then getting into top level groups, being able to set a limit by group that then in turn respects the instance license or the group license.
This is actually, I think we can remove this entire row because the top level group is equal to the top level namespace. Okay. And it's already covered, and it's set only by the administrator. It's already covered by the line above.
I'm gonna leave it and just call out that it's already done and it's covered by the line above. It looks like we have a question.
It's not per se done. It's basically the same from what I understood. It's the same.
Yes, it's
or whatever. Yeah.
Anatoli, did you have a question?
Yeah, right. Can you hear me?
Yep.
You're good.
So I think there are two things that needs to be distinguished here is limits, meaning no more like the limitation, how much can you use? And then quota, meaning the pool of minutes that could be like distributed or reused. So if we're like, they are not equal. So quota could be distributed between projects and groups, but limits are specific to one group or one project. So I think that if we like remove this distinction between quota and limits, we may run into some confusions.
So we're going to specify, and I'm going to stick that back up in the proposal. There we go.
So I think the quota would be what is set by the admin at the top level namespace, or as default default quota from the application limit. It's like if you don't have like a specific quota set for that top level namespace, you get the default. These two values represent the quota that the group or user namespace can use. But what then also, to get a little bit more granular than that, what we are trying to propose here is we can set limits for projects so they can max use this amount of CI minutes for project or subgroups. But the quota is what we refer as the top level namespace CI minutes limit.
So for GitLab.com users, this is license, number of minutes by license, plus any purchase CI minutes. So that would be your quota. Your monthly quota is equivalent to whatever is granted by your license, plus any additional minutes that you purchased. That is your quota for the month. Your limit within that might be different. And that's what we're working on, is really setting CI minute limits that respect then the top level namespace quota. Does that help define that, especially if we add that terminology to the proposal? I'm going to take silence as acceptance.
Just to give you the input, I'm trying to understand how Linux defines quota, because they also have quota on user directories, but I'm not sure if they actually go a level deeper. So it's probably not useful to go into that territory.
I think that at one point Allison and I, I think at one point Allison and I defined this, and we used either the GCP or the AWS language of quotas are things that you cannot set, limits are things that you can. And so we kind of matched up with that terminology. So this aligns with that. I just hadn't done a good job of defining it here in the epic previously. So now that we have some common language around, quota is a pool of minutes that you have to stay within, and a limit is kind of a hard cap for a project or a group within that quota. I think we can keep moving forward. Does that help clarify as well for you, Anatoly?
Yeah, that's good. That's much more clearer. Thanks.
Awesome. All right. I use some fun preview so I don't have to click back and forth. Okay, so then we have the first two rows set. I feel like we're doing good on time, making good progress. So now we get to top level group. And this, you thought that we could, no, sorry, this one's already good as well. This is done. It's the equivalent of the namespace limit above. So now we want to talk about subgroups and projects. Would it be helpful to break these out and say within self-managed and within SaaS? Oh, and
I think whenever possible, I think whenever possible, the behavior should be exactly the same. So the group owner can only set limits for anything that is within the group, right? And it shouldn't be able to set limits for the top level group itself, because that is actually set by the administrator.
Yeah. Group. That's not the top level group. That value is set by. There we go. I can just edit as we go.
I'd be careful with that assumption on who can set that limit, though.
So I think at this point in the table, what we want to define is who we want that persona to be, not exactly who can do it today, because this is functionality that is not completely implemented. So I'd like to try to define end state, or the outcome that we get to for the user kind of from here down. And we can add a row to the table of from here down as new functionality. Is that the right user persona, the group admin who sets that? Would a smaller iteration or an MPC for us be it's instance admins who set that so that self-managed can implement this, or is that what's already implemented for a self-managed user today within the instance administration where they can set a group value?
That's more or less what I was alluding to. I'm not sure if it already exists, but if we can go smaller in terms of iteration, I would go to the instance admin. Also for the user base that was requesting this, which is the Drupal association, they don't mind if it's the instance admin in that sense.
I think for self-managed customers, the instance admin is the right persona. That obviously doesn't work for GitLab.com because we don't want to be taking requests to set group limits.
No, exactly, but it is indeed like a smaller iteration or like a smaller scope in that sense.
So Fabio, you're deep in thought. Is this what we already have today?
No, we don't have.
Can be set?
We don't have that today because for subgroups, we have only for top level groups. I think having the admin as a user persona as MVC makes sense. I think ideally on SaaS, this would be more the group owner to self-service manage the quota within the top level group, how that can be limited among the subgroups. But I think it also makes sense for an admin, maybe from a point of view of reducing resources of a specific problematic subgroup or project that is consuming a lot of minutes. Maybe we might want to apply a limit temporary, so an admin can jump in and set a very specific limit, so at least that is kind of contained and doesn't affect the rest of the shared runners. It might be also like a good example, good use case to have today.
Okay. So we have two open issues today. Our MVC issue configure. This should be limits, not quotas. Oh no, it is limits per project. Somebody else already updated that for me. Nope. I think I'm just continually linking to the epic instead of the actual issue. There we go. Figure CI/CD limits by project. So now that's reads better. And then this one should be redefined, set CI/CD limit per project or subgroup. So are either of those the right, or if we split those issues, the right issue to implement this MVC?
In terms of just a question, more long term. Eventually, I believe we want to open also this use case to group owners to be able to set limit for their own projects or their own subgroups, right? Okay, so because
I think that's the iteration. I think we would start with it's the instance admin. That's going to help solve for that use case for the Drupal community and other self-hosted, especially open source projects where they want to set smaller or within the larger top level group within a subgroup, maybe new limits for those new projects.
Okay.
So we might be able to split the set CI/CD limit per project. And sorry, editing is hard. I think that we could split this and break out the subgroups and the project, make implementation of project quota a separate project limit. I keep saying quota, project limit a separate issue so that we can keep iterating on the subgroup part of it. And then we can iterate on the project part of it and leave that as the next iteration.
It is so is the first iteration kind of focusing on the subgroup we said? So that is not targeting like Drupal use case, or am I wrong?
That's what I'm proposing. If that's not the right MVC or the right first step, let's change it.
So is Drupal primarily interested in limiting projects, since they have everything under one big group?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. That doesn't mean that the subgroup is not interesting, but the main ask is for per project.
Yeah. So we could start our MVC, or our first step, let's not call it an MVC, could be implement for self-managed a per project limit that is set by an instance admin.
Could that be also for SaaS?
It could be.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to keep our scope down.
Okay.
I have a question, James and Fabio. When we say that we are going to make it happen for projects, would those projects only be the ones which to which the namespace in question is a direct parent to? Like, we won't look at projects which are a part of the subgroups inside that project, inside those groups, right?
Yeah, so I think at the moment it would be more the admin can go into any project within GitLab and set CMN's limit for that specific project. And that doesn't matter
Okay.
which level of the hierarchy, groups, subgroups
Got
that
it.
project is. You go directly to that project and set limit. Or there's some admin page where you select the project, and basically you just set the limit for us in any sort of project.
Got it. So it would be somewhere in project setting and would only be accessible to the admin for roles.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
There's the use case that eventually want to extend group owners to also do that, to set limits for any projects that they own within their group. So I'm not sure whether we want to unify the UX there or treat this as two different persona, two different UX. I'm not sure, but eventually we want to be able to set the same values also for from namespace owner persona.
Okay.
All right, so looking at our iteration plan, if our first step was implement a project level quota for self-managed in GitLab SaaS that was set by the instance admin, the outcome there is we address the Drupal use case. We don't really address any use cases for .com today. I dedicated might be able to use that as a single tenant because it's basically self-managed. We're just the admins, but we're not going to support that use case for GitLab.com because our instance admin won't set project level quotas. So then we would need later a implement project level quota on GitLab or on self-managed and GitLab SaaS set by group admin. That would be a later issue. So then if we look at our group level and our subgroup levels, Fabio, I may have imagined, but I thought you and I had a interaction in comments or in one of our one-on-ones that one of these was not doable today. And maybe I misinterpreted that this is already done in our instance level limit that is set, that there was architecture that would need to change to support one of these use cases. But like I said, maybe I misinterpreted. So if I'm looking at like GitLab.org is a group within the GitLab instance. Within that, there are subgroups. Who is the right persona to set the limits for each of those, and what then trickles down and applies to the group in the project?
So the instance admin can set limits for the top level group, GitLab org, for example. From there on, the group admin should be able to set limits for subgroups or specific projects eventually. And we are discussing now here that maybe also the admin, instance admin, should be able to have to jump in and set limits for subgroups or projects eventually. But like, at the minimum, the group owner should have access to setting subgroup level and project level limits.
Okay. And so that's that second line there of implementing those subgroup levels, subgroup level limits. Let me change all of these quotas to limits. Words are hard right after naming things. And so we could split that up to say we're going to support subgroups first for self-managed, because that code is already there for self-managed to support it at the group level. And it's already there, I guess, for .com as well. Just thinking about how these features match up and what code is and who the instance owner is, it's starting to make a little more sense. So implementing that subgroup level limit on self-managed and GitLab SaaS, administered by group admin. And then we don't need the group level limit because that's still your top level namespace limit. That's going to match up to your license. You're not going to be able to, I mean, those the way that I'm thinking about groups, those are actually subgroups.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So we have about 20 minutes left. I want to make sure that we answer questions, though, from our contributors as well. Make sure that we get those answered, as that was, in addition to clarifying some of the direction and the use cases here, which I hope we've done. We want to make sure that questions around MRs that are open get answered, of what's blocking them or what we need to do to get them to a state where we can get them merged. So I want to open it up to ask any questions, answer any questions, comment.
Yeah, right. There is a question if there is any mechanism for tracking changes to those fields. So right now, I've just made MR that adds the field for project limits. And it's really, really basic. But when I need to add interface to log who changed limits and what is this limit, I would appreciate some examples how to do this. And also, when I need to troubleshoot problems with the limits, I would like interface which is also shows which limits I'm currently exceed, or which limit comes into play. So like two problems that I don't know how to code is, first, how to see who set the limit, and second, how to see which limit is active.
Yeah, so also I'm assuming you're speaking about more kind of in terms of implementation there. So at the moment we're saying, we're talking about the MPC, that the instance admin should be able to set the limit for a specific project. We need to figure out, okay, it's probably as a good practice to create a new table specifically for CI minutes limits for projects. So we have like a project ID and especially now that GitLab is separated from the CI database, is separated from the main database. It makes sense for, since we're speaking about CI minutes, for this table to exist in the CI database. And then we can have an admin that has permissions to write that table. So there could be a GraphQL mutation there. So from the front end, we can eventually use this GraphQL mutation to edit a set value for that limit for the project. And this way we should have a way to set and modify the limit. And then the other question is about how enforcing and the UX about enforcing limits. Today, we have only one limit, and we don't need to specify what limit has been hit. But I'm wondering at the moment. I don't know, because that really depends on how the final enforcement is going to look like. But maybe as MVC, it's sufficient that we ensure that the limit that is set at project level is at least equal or lower to the top level group limit, top level group quota. Even now is distinguishing that. So if the group quota is 50,000 and my project can set any limit up to 50,000, I can set to 60,000 or for some reason. And by doing that, then we know that the lower applies and the lower limits is the one that actually is causing the project to fail. That as MVC, but there are scenarios where the project is actually not hitting the limit. It might be another project in the same group that is consuming all the CI minutes. So my pipeline for project A is not failing because project A reached the limit set for it. It's because the group level quota is exhausted. And that is maybe what we are saying here, like it would be beneficial to know which limit has been hit. I think this could be part of the enforcement, whichever limit is being hit is going to be returned in the error message or something. So at least we can tell the user your pipeline, can't run because this limit has been hit. Does it clarify some of your concerns, Anatoly?
Yeah, my connection is not good, but that's for the MVC. I think that's more than enough to for now.
Yeah, I think setting limits, it will not be a complex thing. What might be more complex will be the enforcement of the limits, because we need to check two limits and at the same time, all the time when you might to check, we need to ensure that either if either limit fails, we need to report back which one is failing, and we have some logic which is called like a live tracking of CI minutes that also might need to be duplicated, and we need to count CI minutes being used for a specific project or subgroup. So there is probably a more complexity that we need to discuss about the enforcement. But I think for now we could move forward with the setting up the limits, even though we don't initially enforce. And we look into, before we even enable this feature, we look in more in details on how to enforce CI minutes.
I started a questions to answer section in the epic proposal or the epic description. So far I have what is the UX when a limit is hit for the project or group. I've assigned that to Vijika and myself. How do we know which limit was hit in the code and what is passed to the front end? Caroline, I've assigned that to you. Where is the limit stored? Also assigned to Caroline. And what is the UX for setting the limit at the subgroup project? And I think we have design open for that. So it's assigned to Vijika and myself. So we'll get those questions answered and link to the answers as well, so that we have that source of truth going through the epic. And then we can reference back to it from the issues, just to keep track of these things as we're answering them. Cool. What other questions can we answer? And then before we wrap up, I want to quickly just talk about what are next steps. Okay, seeing no other questions, moving into next steps. For me, I think the next steps are get these questions to answered. I think that helps unlock the MRs. I think we should also comment back in the MRs of where the business logic differs from where we're going direction-wise and what we want to enforce around that idea of your quota is still the top level limit for GitLab.com or for the instance, and your limit by project or subgroup needs to respect that, regardless of what you set it at. Or if you have a bunch of limits that would add up to more than your quota, they still need to respect the quota at the end of the day. Great. Well, I think we've added a lot of good detail, hopefully answered some questions, found more questions to answer. And I'll do a little bit more cleaning up of the additional details table within the epic description and breaking down some issues, duplicating some issues to break out the different use cases so that we have one per issue. We're not trying to mix things that might in turn influence what those MRs look like, but hopefully it doesn't cause too much strife for the contributors. Would it be beneficial to do this again in a couple of weeks, have another shorter synchronous call or office hours call as we continue on this project?
I think at some point we need to probably have another more detailed discussion.
Okay.
When we tackle the part of enforcement of CI minutes, because there is a lot of logic there that needs to be either duplicate or we find an efficient way of dealing with that. At the moment, I haven't looked into the details on how that could be implemented, but it's something that as soon as we tackle the part of setting limits, it will be the second part of this implementation that requires more discussion. Okay. So then depends on the contributors whether we find an efficient way of discussing these various proposals and trade-offs. Direct async might be perfect. Otherwise, we would need to have another kind of detailed call where we might want to answer to specific questions.
Okay. Well, I'll post this back to the shared channel that we have with the folks at Drupal and say that at some point we think we should have discussion around enforcing the limits, storing and enforcing limits, tracking. And as they get closer to that, then we can schedule some office hours just for wider contributors to join and talk through any implementation details as needed. And Natalie, would that be helpful for you as well, since you're kind of representing all our contributors here? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, that will be useful because I see that's a big potential in the limits in general. Because, for example, if I want to run some machine learning tasks and I already have a GitLab infrastructure, I would reuse that because everything is already there. So I just need a different interface than the CI pipelines, but I would use the same minutes for that. So I would be interested to see what an interface for managing quotas, limits, and buying additional like packs could look like, because it's borders with thin ops, this kind of topic that
Yeah.
picked trends like recently. So I'm also like interested in that.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll get this shared on GitLab Unfiltered. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Caroline, for helping with notes and keeping us on track. And we'll get this shared out and link back to the epic. And like I said, I'll take a next action of doing some issue split and cleanup of additional details today. All right. Thanks, everyone. Just under time. Have a great day. Cheers.